Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Welcome to this UNICEF WHO JMP GLAAS webinar on monitoring climate resilient wash. It's a review of evidence. We're just going to wait a couple of minutes for more people to join the meeting room, and then we'll start the webinar. In the meantime, please do feel free to introduce yourself through the chat, and we will be using the chat throughout the webinar for comments, questions, and answers. A good number of people. We're getting a good number of people coming in the room now, so I just wanted to share the agenda. I'm going to pass the microphone to Bruce Gordon at WHO to open in just a minute. We'll also hear from Jose Gesti at SWA. We'll have a brief overview of this project about monitoring climate resilient wash from Tom Slamick at UNICEF. And then Barbara Evans at the University of Leeds is going to present the main course of the webinar, the results of the set of reviews that have been done. We'll then have an open Q&A discussion that Tom will facilitate. We'll be using the chat for that, so please do prepare your comments and questions and then have them ready to put in the chat at that time. Then Fiona Gore from WHO will close by talking about the next steps, including a public consultation. So with that, let me pass the microphone over to Bruce Gordon to open the webinar. Bruce, over to you.
Okay, thanks so much, Rick. And you'll hear more from Rick and Tom and the JMP team in due course. But my name's Bruce Gordon, and I lead the water sanitation hygiene work at WHO. And I'm also the vice chair of UN Water. So Rick mentioned the webinar. Thank you for joining us. I just wanted to acknowledge that this is a very substantive effort, and you'll hear from all our project partners. But I also wanted to highlight that a big part of this effort is our commitment to have public outreach and consultations. And I hope that throughout the course of this discussion this morning that you will learn something, but we also hope that you will be able to contribute. So as Rick said, we're quite excited about active contributions, despite for some of you this being morning. So just very briefly, of course, WHO and UNICEF are very interested in this topic because of the burden of disease, the impacts of inadequate wash on health and development of children and of all people. And we know that climate exacerbates all these risks and is a real brake on our efforts to try to get to the SDG target of universal access to water and sanitation. So we were approached. There was a lot of people that were curious about to what extent wash services were adapted to climate change and to what extent there was resilience measures put in place. And of course, we host the Joint Monitoring Programme jointly and the Global Analysis and Assessment of Sanitation and Drinking Water, which we do for UN Water, and that's also a joint program between UNICEF and WHO. So we were excited to kind of take the challenge on. I think many of you, or at least I personally thought, oh, well, we may have some silver bullet indicators here, a few top-level global indicators that will solve everyone's problems and we can answer those questions, but you will hear from our colleagues and friends that it's actually quite a bit more complicated than that. And so therefore we have put in place quite a comprehensive effort, as I've said. And I think the thing I'm also excited about is these are global indicator development, but it's also national. So there's many indicators that are at local level that may be very useful at that level, but may not necessarily be applicable to global. So hopefully it's a discussion and a conversation that will sort of meet all our needs. But let me just say that I see Barbara Evans here from the University of Leeds. It's great to have you here, Barbara. I'm sure there's others from our university consortium, University of Technology, Sydney, University of Bristol, Oxford University, and of course, we are working with a number of experts in a technical working group. And we are very excited to have partners like Sanitation and Water for All. I see Jose will be welcoming you just after me. But let me sort of conclude by just saying this. This effort on trying to tackle adaptation measures to climate and monitor them and measure them is a huge priority of the UN system in general. We have a new sort of, when I say novel, we've never had this before, but we have 36 agencies working on water in the UN system, and we've agreed by the sort of mandated by the UN Secretary General to work together on this effort. So this is wonderful because we know this is not just about WASH. We know this is about other aspects of the SDG target: water use efficiency, water resource management, ecosystems, and means of implementation. So we really need to work together. And of course, member states won't be discussing the post-2030 agenda for a little bit of time now. I think we're thinking 2027. But we need to be very much prepared technically when those discussions happen, to be sort of ready and fit for purpose with these indicators. So that's a long way of saying this is a big effort. It's going to take some time, and it's a big part of the global goal of adaptation, which Jose will talk to you about and may say some other interesting things. So over to you, Jose, and thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Bruce. Thank you, colleagues in WHO, in UNICEF, and the Joint Monitoring Programme, and all the participants. Yeah, you are right, Bruce. What I wanted to highlight is about the global goal on adaptation. I think the work, this amazing work that is being undertaken right now on the development of indicators by WHO, UNICEF, the Joint Monitoring Programme, is excellent. It's something that those of us that we started to work more than a decade ago on this interface of water, sanitation, hygiene, and climate change, we've been dreaming on for many years. To bring it into context, I honestly think that our community, water, sanitation, and hygiene community, was ready to have this discussion and to work on development of indicators. But I could say that a little bit more than a year ago, at COP28 in Dubai, we celebrated something that we have to be very proud, which is a major achievement for us. At COP28, there was an agreement on a common framework for global climate resilience. And why this is so important for us is because this framework, which is a global framework agreed among all the parties to the Paris Agreement, highlights water and sanitation in its first target. This is unprecedented for us. We have a global framework on resilience, setting a first target that spells out climate resilient water supply and climate resilient sanitation. And yeah, this is of ultimate importance. I think since that happened, again, we were ready and we've been working on this interface of WASH and water, sanitation, and hygiene and climate for years. But I think this opportunity that this global framework brings has moved us in many good directions, I could say. Last year, 1 year after, only a month, 2 months ago at COP29, we've been launching important things for us, such as a standalone guidelines from the Green Climate Fund on how to develop sanitation proposals. As a water, sanitation, and hygiene community, we came together and we launched at the Water Pavilion at COP29 a definition on what does it mean for us, climate resilient water supply and sanitation, which are preconditions, right? Like having a good understanding of what do we mean by climate resilient water supply and sanitation. It's a necessary baseline, right? To try to understand how do we measure progress towards such a thing. So yeah, I'm very happy that we were able to do that. We are now fastly moving towards COP30. COPs are static moments in the calendar, but it drives a lot of energy in preparation for them. COP30, it's fundamentally important for us as well. It's perceived as the adaptation COP, and that's where all the official work on the development of indicators will be presented and agreed by parties of the Paris Agreement. The work that UNICEF, WHO, in the Joint Monitoring Programme, and GLAAS is fundamental to inform this formal process. And yeah, we are very excited to see this moving. Again, it's going to be transformative, having a definition and then indicators to measure climate resilient water supply, sanitation, and hygiene systems is going to be a key momentum for us. And I really would like to celebrate this moment with all the advances that we are about to see. Again, congratulations to GLAAS, JMP, WHO, and UNICEF and all the consortia and the universities behind all this hard work to get us there. Over to you, Rick.
Thanks so much, Jose. I think now we're going to move to Tom Slaymaker, and I'll let Tom introduce himself.
Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. I'm Tom Slaymaker. I'm leading the UNICEF side of the Joint Monitoring Programme, and I'm just going to give a brief overview of what we're trying to do with this project, and then we will hear from our consortium of partners about the progress that's been made so far. So, Rick, next slide, please. Firstly, just wanted to introduce the team. So it's a joint review between JMP and GLAAS, and we have a secretariat. So I lead the UNICEF side of the Joint Monitoring Programme. My colleague, Rick Johnston, leads the WHO side. You heard from him earlier. Also online, we have the GLAAS team, which is led by Fiona Gore, and also Marina Takane, Betsy Engebretsen are on the WHO side, and Janet Tim, who is on the UNICEF side of the GLAAS team. Betsy and Janet are based in the US, so they joined the session yesterday. So we are the secretariat that are jointly steering this project, and you can reach out to us if you have questions. But let's move on to the next slide, please, Rick. So if you're not familiar with the JMP, then I'm going to give a brief overview of what we do. We are a joint program that's been well established since the 90s. We were responsible for monitoring the MDGs and now the SDGs, but we have evolved over time. So we have always monitored WASH in households, and we are now expanding and monitoring WASH in schools and WASH in healthcare facilities. We have also substantially revised and updated the ladders that we use for measuring and monitoring WASH between the MDGs and the SDGs. And we're now in a rhythm of producing reports for each of these settings every 2 years. So we produce updates for households in odd years. We have a household update coming later this year. And we produce updates for schools and healthcare facilities in even years. So we produced updates for schools and healthcare facilities last year. And we're in a continuous cycle of country consultation. So before each update, we send out our draft estimates to UNICEF and WHO country offices. There is then a period of 2 months of technical consultation on those estimates before we publish them. But we also engage a lot with member states, supporting them to strengthen national monitoring of WASH in household, schools, and healthcare facilities. So that's the JMP. And then moving on to the GLAAS. So the GLAAS, which is the UN Water Global Analysis and Assessment of Sanitation and Drinking Water, is a sort of sister program to the JMP. The GLAAS is responsible for monitoring the inputs and the processes that lead to the outputs and the outcomes that the JMP monitors. The GLAAS team run a survey, which is an intensive process that's carried out in a large number of countries, looking at a number of different elements of the WASH system. So looking at finance, monitoring, governance, and human resources, all of these important elements that can be used to track progress towards SDG 6. The purpose of the GLAAS is really to try and identify what are the drivers of progress, what are the bottlenecks to progress, and the GLAAS also produces regular reports. There'll be a new report coming out later this year. And the GLAAS also has responsibility for monitoring the current SDG targets, so in particular targets 6A and 6B, which are referred to as the targets for the means of implementation. Important to note also that the GLAAS works with a very wide range of partners, many of whom are on this call. Next slide, please. So it's a joint review because we recognize that monitoring climate resilience requires us to look not only at the outputs and outcomes that the JMP monitors, but also policies and the finances and the capacity that the GLAAS is monitoring. The purpose of this review is really to look at all of the different frameworks that are already out there that can guide us when it comes to thinking about monitoring climate resilient wash, to look at the various indicators that already exist and have already been collected in one form or another, but really importantly also to look at the data collection mechanisms. So we are looking for practical ways in which climate resilience can be measured and monitored primarily at a national level and ultimately at a global level. And this is a really big challenge. In order to do this, we have identified a consortium of academic institutions. You're going to hear from them in a moment, but University of Leeds, University of Bristol, University of Oxford, and University of Technology in Sydney. And this consortium came together in March to start the work. We've also established a technical working group. This is an external technical working group of independent experts drawn from a range of different backgrounds. And the purpose of the technical working group is not only to provide inputs into the review, but also to review the outputs and to give us advice and guidance on the feasibility of taking those recommendations forward. The ultimate purpose is that the review will identify areas where the GLAAS and the JMP can focus in future when it comes to monitoring climate resilience. But hopefully the review will also provide a lot of interesting information that can be used by other partner organizations for other aspects of monitoring at different levels. As Bruce mentioned, we're very keen to ensure that we're engaging as many stakeholders as possible. This is partly about ensuring that we get to hear from all of the different colleagues who are working on this from different angles, at different levels, in different countries, to make sure that we are harvesting all of the good practice that is already out there, but also to try and build consensus in terms of the way we think about and we talk about this issue, and hopefully to build consensus around a small set of technical proposals that can be taken forward for global monitoring. We had a kickoff webinar last July. So this is a follow-up webinar to explain where we've got to with the review and opportunities to input. We've also been running sessions at various global conferences, and we've integrated conversations on this topic into a number of recent trainings that we've held at regional level and at country level. So we have a whole range of different ways of engaging, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. And then, as Jose said, we are also hoping to feed into and to influence and inform the work that's going on the global goal on adaptation. There is a group which has come together and is responsible for trying to come up with a set of no more than 100 indicators that can be used to measure and monitor all of the different targets under the global goal on adaptation. That's a very big task, and that group needs to start to put forward some technical proposals starting in May. So we're hoping that we can position ourselves to feed into that process and to provide some reassurance that WASH sector stakeholders have a pipeline of work which is going to generate some useful indicators that can be used for this purpose. There are many targets under the global goal on adaptation, but the one that we are primarily interested in is the one relating to water. So if you look at the agreement from the COP, you'll see that there is paragraph 9, and under paragraph 9, there is a water target 9A which is the main one that we are trying to feed into. Next slide, please. So in terms of as I mentioned, we kicked off in March last year. We've had technical working group meetings. We had that public webinar back in July. And then we had a sort of in-depth first meeting with the technical working group in December to go through some of the preliminary outputs. We are working towards a second working group meeting where we will go into much more detail. And then we have a series of steps taking us through the end of the year and into 2025. Part of our purpose is to produce a scoping paper, which is already available on the website, to review the evidence, but ultimately to come up with a long list of indicators and then to consult on that long list of indicators, to narrow it down to a much shorter list between May and September, and then to start to pilot test those indicators. So where we have countries that are interested or partners that are interested to test out these indicators and provide feedback on how they perform in national monitoring systems, then we're very interested to do that as much as possible as we build up to the discussions on what will come after 2030. So that the opportunities along the way for stakeholders to input, this is one of them, so please watch this space. Next slide, please. So in terms of the output so far, we have a scoping document, which is explaining in quite a lot of detail the scope of the review, so what's in and what's out, and where we are drawing the lines around WASH vis-a-vis other sectors. Also, the definitions and the terminology. There's a lot of complex terminology here, and we're trying to clarify what we mean by certain terms so that everybody is speaking the same language. You're going to hear in a moment about the output of the evidence reviews. There are 4 evidence reviews, and those will be shared in a moment. And then we're working on this long list of indicators. So we're planning to discuss that with our technical working group and then to launch a public consultation on that long list of indicators starting mid-April. You can find all of this on the project website. We'll paste the link into the chat, but you can also sign up if you haven't signed up already to get updates about the project. So when we add information to the website, we'll send you an update so you can go and have a look. Next slide, please. Right, so with that, I am now going to pass over to Barbara Evans, who is leading the team at the University of Leeds and will talk us through the outputs of the review so far. Barbara.
Great, thank you so much, Tom. Good morning, good evening to everybody. It's definitely morning for me. It's lovely to be here. Really great to see so many participants on this meeting, and we're really super excited to share this work because we are learning as we go here, and there's so much of interest to share with people. The first thing I need to say is that, of course, the work that I'm going to briefly present is the result of the work of a huge number of people. Shown here are the people that have actually done the hard graft. I'm sure many of you that know anything about universities will know that I'm a professor and therefore I do very little at all. And most of the work is done by a fabulous cohort of young researchers and students. I particularly want to call out Lily King, James Wallace, Kelly Moon, and Anisha Nijawan, who have really led the reviews, which I'm going to share with you. Lily does exist. We just didn't find a photograph of her in time, in case you're wondering. We haven't obliterated her. So next slide, Tom. Rick, can't remember who's controlling the slides. So before I give you the detail, I'm going to give you the headlines, and we'll come back to these at the end. So the headline messages from the evidence reviews. So the first thing to say is that there are many frameworks for climate resilience, both within and outside the WASH sector. And one of the things we'll reflect on a little bit is the balance of work that's been done from our sector compared to others. The second point to make about those frameworks is that they propose many attributes and many adaptation actions that could be used as indicators for climate resilient WASH. So our count just for the WASH frameworks that we've looked at, for example, which is a tiny slice of all the literature we've looked at, we found 550 candidate indicators for climate resilient WASH, so a lot. But headline news from the reviews, there is limited evidence to show how good these indicators are at predicting climate resilience. So everything that we will be doing in the project from here on in, from the consortium side and from the Secretariat side, will be balancing ideas around the efficacy, the suitability of various indicators, but also taking into account the ones which have stronger or weaker evidence bases. It's also true that we've looked at a lot of frameworks which are used in what we call WASH adjacent sectors. So, for example, the health sector, energy, roads, disaster risk reduction. And there we find a lot of good information and ideas about how to express indicators for service outcomes and user satisfaction that reflect climate resilience. And we'll come back to what that means. And on the basis of all of this, even though the evidence is limited, I think our general conclusion is that we will be able to propose a subset of indicators that cover adaptation actions, attributes, service outcomes, and user satisfaction with a degree of confidence. But one thing that we want the sort of global WASH community to take into account as we go through, particularly the global consultation on the long list, is to understand the levels of evidence which exist and to understand the variability of that evidence. So I mentioned these attributes, adaptation actions, service outcomes, and user satisfaction. Why do we use these terms? We use these terms because we have a scope for this project, which we've developed in dialogue with work that's gone on at the Sanitation and Water for All initiative to develop a definition of climate resilient WASH, as Jose mentioned, also in dialogue with work that is going on as part of the efforts towards the global goal for adaptation, and cognizant of what the IPCC say about climate resilient development. So this is the world that we work in. The blue dotted line shows that inside the line is everything that's inside our project, and outside the line is everything that's outside. So if we go to the next slide, we have 4 broad areas where we are looking for indicators. And you can think about this a little bit like a log frame or a theory of change. So at the sort of upstream end, at the sort of input, really, really high level input end, we are looking for indicators of adaptation actions that might be taken by national government or subnational government, or which might be taken by service providers, or which might be taken by users, which would promote the resilience of WASH services. So adaptation actions essentially are, we put those in buckets that are sometimes termed enabling environment. Some of them would be about policy, finance, regulation, all of those types of things. The second bucket, if you like, are the attributes of water, sanitation and hygiene infrastructure, and the attributes of water resources and receiving waters, which are immediately connected to the provision of water supply and sanitation and hygiene services. So these would be physical attributes, for example, of infrastructure, but also performance attributes of various kinds. What we think of broadly is that those adaptation actions and attributes, if they do promote climate resilience, then what we would see as an outcome would be water and sanitation service functioning characteristics and hand washing functioning, which reflect resilience in the face of extreme weather events which are associated with climate. So this could be continuity of supply, length of time that services are interrupted, rapidity of recovery of services, those types of things. And then finally, at the really high level outcome level, we're interested in measures of the user experience of their water, sanitation and hygiene services in the face of climate change. So to what extent do users feel in control? Are they aware of what's coming? Are they able to plan and prepare? How stressful is the experience of intermittent breaks in water supply, for example? So those are the 4 broad areas: adaptation actions, attributes, water, sanitation and hygiene service functioning, and user experience, and I'll touch on those as we go through. So going to the next slide, we carried out a large number of evidence reviews. we always say there are 4. They seem to have multiplied and split and divided. If any of you have ever seen the Harry Potter movies or read the books, there's an incident where somebody casts a spell, which means every time you drop something on the floor, it multiplies into 100 versions of itself. And sometimes I feel like that's a little bit how this project has developed. And that's not a criticism of the Secretariat at all. That's something which we've developed jointly as we've explored the evidence. So the first thing I'm going to touch on are 2 evidence reviews that deal with attributes and adaptation actions. The first looks at water supply, and the second is split into 2 parts. The first part looks at sanitation, and the second part looks at hygiene. And particularly in the hygiene review, we were looking at hygiene supply chains and behaviour change programmes. We didn't include infrastructure in the hygiene review because it was already included in the sanitation and water supply reviews. So it's just to clarify that point. So these 3 reviews on water supply, sanitation and hygiene are complete. The water supply review is what we call a review of reviews, because there are already a lot of systematic reviews around water and climate resilience. The sanitation and hygiene reviews are brand new systematic reviews that we've just completed. So if we go to the next slide, sort of just so you can get a sense. So the first thing to say is this is a little plot which shows the number of studies that we could include in our systematic reviews: 28 for hygiene, 17 for sanitation and 19 for water. There are a lot of studies on this topic. So we have reviewed just a little more than 4,000 papers for the sanitation review, a little more than 5,000 for the hygiene review as an example. But we had very strict criteria to bring down those reviews. We were looking specifically for studies which had climate-specific analysis, which had clear measures of the outcomes or the attributes or the climate resilience effects, if you like, and which explained in detail what particular adaptation attributes or adaptation actions were being included. And where we couldn't find that information, we were not able to include those studies in the review. So there's a lot of literature, but a relatively small number, which really is evidential, that we can therefore say, here is some evidence that links adaptation action X to climate resilient outcome Y. So that's the first thing to say. The second thing to say is to look at the geographical scope. It's very wide. We have in the range of studies we've looked at, first of all, we have a range of high, low and middle income countries. I noticed in the chat in passing there was a question about Australia, for example. There are studies which cover Australia. There are studies which cover, as I say, high income countries and low income countries. There is a little bit of clustering. I mean, just out of interest, Bangladesh crops up quite a lot, but I think those of us that have worked in Bangladesh will understand why that might be. Just to look at this graph for a moment and point out that sanitation and hygiene studies appear to be more country or project focused, but that is partly because many of the water supply studies are classified as global studies because, as I said, they are reviews of reviews. So they cover a number of daughter studies, if you like, which have covered multiple countries. Next slide, please. This little figure shows us essentially the climate hazards which are considered, and we're just plotting this by number of studies. And the headline thing to say here is that rain and flood effects, so extreme rainfall and flooding, tend to be very well represented in the sanitation studies, and drought is very well represented in the water supply studies. But it's not that there's no flooding or rainfall considered in the water supply studies, but there's a bias towards drought in water supply and there's a bias towards flooding and rainfall in sanitation. And also, interestingly, in hygiene. I don't think that that's a big surprise for those of us that work in the sector, but it's interesting to see that reflection in the literature. Okay, going on. So briefly, I just wanted to highlight a couple of key findings. Here are just a couple of points to pull out from the water supply review. Something that I think is very important here. So there is a lot of literature on climate resilience and water supply. It's a much more mature literature than the sanitation and hygiene literature. And that's why we were able to do review of reviews rather than looking for individual studies. But by and large, the quantitative evidence is relatively low. And generally, quantitative results are only shown in modeling studies. So they're not reporting empirical data, they're reporting potential future modeled data. So qualitative data is much more common. Now, qualitative data is tremendously valuable. And when qualitative studies are carried out well, they are invaluable indeed. But what it does mean is that we have to be very careful about assessing the quality of the studies that we include. And it also does mean that there are some aspects which we are lacking. So if somebody were to ask us, what's the probability of something happening from the evidence, we can speak in general terms about how frequently we see those things occurring, but we can't go to the level of probability. Generally, there's a lot of focus on adaptation actions by government, by service providers or users. There's very little actually, or relatively little, on the physical attributes of infrastructure, which I found very surprising. And to some extent, some very helpful ideas around outcome reporting, so water supply continuity, unmet demand, and user experience, for example, of supply rationing. Briefly on the sanitation side, if we just go to the next slide, here are some summary statistics for the sanitation studies. At the top left, we can see that there's quite a strong bias towards adaptation actions by service providers again. That's not entirely surprising because service providers actually play such a critical role in resilience, as we all know. There's quite a nice spread of interventions that cover technical aspects, operational aspects, and we've made a bucket here called enabling environment. That would be policy, regulation, and finance. There's a reasonable spread across sewers, treatment systems, on-site pit latrine, septic tank type systems, reasonably well represented in the literature. And generally, as we said, there tends to be quite a strong focus on flooding. So that's broadly where we are with sanitation, some really useful results, but fewer studies than we might like to see. Now, the second part of the review that we did is in a bucket called R1, which was to look at WASH frameworks, WASH adjacent frameworks or resources and frameworks that are used in sectors other than WASH. And we did that through a grey literature review and also through an academic systematic review. If you like, these R1 studies, it's like looking down the other end of the telescope. With the evidence reviews R3 and R4, we were looking for work that people had done on the ground empirically to understand how projects or maybe national programs are delivered and what happens on the ground when such systems which have experienced those interventions are stressed by climate change related weather events. Here in R1, we're looking at how people have conceptualized the whole question of resilience and what does that tell us for potential indicators. So I'm going to go through these three studies briefly. So starting with R1A, we did a call for WASH frameworks. Many of you contributed excellent frameworks. Thank you very much. There's a very rich literature of people, what would I say, theoretically presenting a very mature conceptual understanding of what climate resilience is. But we had to exclude a lot of these studies, these papers and these position documents from the review because they actually lacked practical monitoring information or suggestions. So the general framing was very useful for us in framing the scope of our study, but in terms of as a source of really practical ideas for indicators, many of the framings were less useful. We go to the next slide. Just to summarize amongst the WASH frameworks, despite that, we have about, I think, 7 frameworks which are included. And even though I said there weren't that many, we did manage to extract 590 candidate indicators or sub-indicators, so many indicators which have been proposed. So a much bigger number than we find from the evidence reviews. And they cut across a range of areas, policy, financing, supply chains, infrastructure. They're very broad, all of the areas that I think we would all feel would be very important. They tend to be slightly more biased towards water, and I think that reflects what I said before. There's almost twice as many indicators for water than for sanitation and hygiene. And that's really a reflection of the maturity of thinking probably in that area. Hygiene on its own is rather poorly represented in these frameworks. Going to the next part of R1, we then looked at WASH adjacent resources. So here we're talking about sectors which have characteristics, some of which are similar to the WASH sector. So for example, we looked at the energy sector as a typical utility service sector, which has both sort of large-scale infrastructure delivery systems and small-scale retail characteristics. We looked at the health sector, we looked at disaster risk response, we looked at the road sector. We had 51 resources. There are fewer of these big framing conceptual documents in other sectors compared to ours, and that's a very interesting finding for us. We included 11 of these in the final review, which were the ones that truly had a climate focus. There was a lot of variation of definition and understanding of resilience. So I just want to call back to comments that Chose made right at the beginning about the work that's been done to come up with a common definition and some common conceptualization for the sector. And one of the things we conclude from our work is that that is an incredibly useful thing to have done and for us all to continue to work on. From these resources, we extracted a further 429 indicators or sub-indicators, some of which we can extract directly and some of which we can extract and then modify because we can make the corollary from, for example, the energy sector to the water sector. And again, they cover a really wide range of policies, plans, governance, financing, and so on. Here we have less indicators that link specifically to infrastructure or technology because that's where the corollary generally breaks down. And finally, we did an academic systematic review for the same sort of evidence that we've been looking for in the water sector, but we were looking now in these WASH adjacent sectors. And we were looking for articles which proposed and preferably tested indicators of climate resilience. We screened 2,400 records, of which about 1,500 were screened in detail. We assessed 846 full text articles and approximately 184 articles are included in this review. We're just doing some checking, so that number may change slightly. Here again, a bit of a theme, another round about 500 indicators and sub-indicators have been extracted, largely from the health system, from transportation and the energy sector. So if you've been keeping score, you'll see that somewhere around 1,500 or so candidate indicators have been extracted from all of this literature, which is a very big list. I used to have beautiful, long, blonde, flowing hair, and since this has started, I've had to wear this wig to cover the grey. It's a big job. Okay, so going on, we have also been considering how we might collect data, and we have a sort of parallel piece of work which is going along rather slowly in the background to think about methods of data collection and analysis. And just to click on one, what we're doing here at the moment is when we transfer candidate indicators to the long list, they are tagged with a lot of information, including any of this evidence that I've just been discussing, information about how and where they've been used. And we also will be tagging them all with information about if that was an indicator that we wanted to use, what type of data would we need and what kind of methods would we use for collecting that data. So there's some data collection tags here just to summarize that that's an important aspect. So moving on, you've seen this slide before, but now perhaps it makes more sense. So I'll just go through these key points again. So the first point from all of this evidence is that the first point is that here we go, that there are many frameworks, both for climate resilience, both within and outside the WASH sector. I mean, there are a lot in the WASH sector, and I have to say that that's a good and a bad thing. I think there is some excellent conceptual work that's gone on in the WASH sector, but perhaps we are a little bit of a vociferous sector, a little bit of a verbose sector. We're all very prone to writing our own framings and ideas. So again, just to call back to Chose, that I think we need to think a lot about how to bring some order to that thinking. Second point is that the frameworks both inside and outside the WASH sector allow us to propose many attributes and adaptation actions. Inside the wash sector, we found about 550, primarily, as I said, related to attributes and adaptation actions. But particularly in the wash sector, there are many, many, many more indicators proposed than there are indicators for which we have really robust evidence. Now, that's not a reason in the end not to use those indicators, but we feel quite strongly it's helpful for us all to be aware of the extent of the backing for some of these ideas. And it also tells us that there are very useful and important areas where we could improve data collection. Even regular project management data collection could build up this evidence base, I think. The next point I want to make is that the frameworks used in the WASH adjacent sectors, so those last two R1 reviews, R1B and R1C, do give us some really useful ideas about how to express service outcomes and user satisfaction within climate resilience. So, for example, the energy sector has spent a lot of time thinking about how you express and how you identify and then express acceptable periods of power outage, for example, which is an excellent corollary for breaks in your water supply. There is a lot of work that's done on acceptable levels of uncertainty for users about the probability of a break in service occurring in the near future or in the further future. So those have been very useful. We can propose a subset of indicators, but just to let everybody know from our reviews that the level of evidence varies. All of these studies will be published, and the high-level results and summaries of all of this data will be made available on the project website as we go along. So we're not trying to keep all the details under. I just didn't want to blind you with all of the details because it's pretty heavy stuff. The final point I want to make is that from the more than 1,500 individual indicators that we have read about in these reviews and that we've listed and combed through, those are not all going to end up on the long list. There's a lot of overlap, there's a lot of ordering and sorting that we can do. At the moment, we have a long list of around about 360 candidate indicators. We're not saying that will be the eventual size of the long list, but just to give you an idea that there is a lot of sort of marginal overlap in this very long list of indicators that we've found. So hopefully people won't be too terrified by the thought of the long list that's coming towards the end of April. And with that, I will hand back to Tom, I think.
Thank you very much, Barbara. That's a very nice, concise summary of a huge amount of work and a huge amount of processing of evidence. So thank you very much, and congratulations to you and all of your colleagues. And maybe we can just leave that last slide up because that's a nice starting point for our discussions. We want to allow time for people to make comments or to ask questions or just to give some reflections based on their own work and their own experience. We cannot unmute you, but you are free to type in the chat. So please do raise your questions in the chat and we'll try to address them over the next 20-25 minutes. While we wait for people to type, we already have a couple. So maybe we can start with those, Barbara.
Yes.
There's one on inequalities, there's one on mitigation, another on adjacent sectors, and one on the criteria for the level of evidence. But maybe we'll start at the top. So I think Daniel Deere from Australia is asking about inequalities and quite rightly pointing out that the JMP data, which rely on national data, are not always capturing the entire population, especially small minorities. We're very aware of that, and we try to highlight that in our reports. But the data we use for global monitoring are only as good as the national statistics. But I think his point is how can we consider these inequalities when it comes to climate resilience, and are they different, perhaps, to the ways in which we've been thinking about inequalities in the past? It's not just a JMP question, I think it's also a GLAAS question, because of course the GLAAS survey offers opportunities to ask about inequalities in terms of policies and interventions that are designed to address inequalities. So maybe we can start with that one. Has this come through in the review?
Yeah, first of all, that's a really terrific question. I have to make a confession that I used a slightly simplified version of our scoping diagram in this set of slides. When we share the slides with the whole group, we can perhaps tag in the slightly more elaborate scoping document. It's just a little bit hard to sort of get your head around it on the screen. We recognise all the way through that all of these areas, so the adaptation actions, the attributes, the service functioning, and the user experience outcomes could all have equity dimensions. And I think that's very important. My observation is that from the evidence reviews, there's not a lot of evidence of what we might think of as disaggregated effects. I might just call on, I think James is probably on the call. I don't know, James, if that would be true for the sanitation review. I can't quite see who's here actually. I can see Kelly's here, James is here. Oh, and Anisha's here, fine. So I'll just ask James maybe and then Anisha, if you had any thoughts on that, if you found anything about the equality effects or the effects on the distributional effects in the evidence reviews.
Yeah, I mean, there's some studies that focused on certain populations, but a lot of them were quite general. So I wouldn't say there was any disaggregated effects found in the reviews.
Mm-hmm. Would that be the same, Anisha, for you?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, but I'm going to then call on Kelly, because my sense is that that would be much more sophisticatedly dealt with in the framework. So Kelly, I don't know if you want to speak to that point.
Yeah, I think both in the WASH frameworks and on the WASH adjacent literature, there has been a bit of focus on how do we assess kind of equity within resilience. There's also been a number of indicators that, and I think someone else had a question related to kind of compiling these indices together. So looking at different components of resilience, so community resilience, kind of health, wider resilience. And so that's kind of come up in the WASH adjacent frameworks and also the WASH frameworks.
Yeah. I mean, just a reflection from my side that I think as a group, you know, it's a question which is incredibly important and needs to be looked at within the challenges generally around collecting these types of data and doing that in a meaningful way. I think we have an opportunity to set off on the right path is what I conclude from where we are with this programme. But it is undoubtedly a challenge. I think none of us think that it's a simple question to address. I'm going to pass back to Tom because you can probably see the hands better than me.
Thank you, good. So that's on inequalities, and I think this question is going to keep coming back, especially under the Global Goal on Adaptation, for example. There's a very strong commitment to have a focus on inequalities and to understand the differential impacts of climate change, which may be very different in different contexts. And so we need to continue to think about that. Maybe we can go to the question on adjacent sectors, and then we'll come to mitigation. Mm-hmm. So there's a question from Ian Nafs about, how are we getting the balance right between, working with adjacent sectors, working on general measures, I suppose, to do with building resilience, versus the more specific measures that we would want to see within the so-called WASH sector. And how do you see that playing out, Barbara, based on the work you've done, especially Kelly's review of the adjacent sectors?
Yes, that's a super important question. I do want to distinguish two slightly separate things. The first is a rather sort of I don't know what I want to say. I can't think of a good word for it. What sort of in the weeds, detailed point that one of the reasons why we're looking at the adjacent sectors is not because we want to. Well, the main reason why we included them in the evidence reviews is not because we want to bring specific measures, for example, from the energy sector into our recommendations, but that we want to see and understand how other sectors look at this problem, because they are models for what our sector could be doing, or they are potentially models. So we're not, when we talk about this review of the adjacent sectors adjacent to WASH, we're generally looking for ideas around the syntax of how you express indicators, for example, or a sense of the balance between. So there's always choices, for example, between higher level, so adaptation action at government level, for example, which have the potential to have a big reach and a big impact across a wide range of users, but which are harder to assess for quality compared to very specific indicators of, you know, the depth of cover of concrete on a pipe, which is easier to measure but is very specific to a single case. And we've kind of been interested to look at the adjacent sectors to see how people balance that tension between extent and scope. Also, it's been interesting because in our sector we have the GLAAS and GMP, and that's been quite an interesting reflection. I think one of the big powerful things which we already have in place is this commitment to an understanding of the importance of these governance level adaptation actions, if you like, the sort of input side actions. And I think that looking at adjacent sectors has helped us to think about that. You know, that's a difficult area, and Fiona and her team will attest. It's very difficult to collect data which is meaningful and robust of those. You know, it's very easy to say, do you have a policy which says X? It's much harder to say, is your policy which says X any good? And so we were looking in the adjacent sectors for some, particularly around some of those what we might think of as GLAAS family of indicators to get ideas. Now, I am just going to your second point, however, that the hint in your question is also that, of course, WASH and the resilience of WASH is informed by wider societal WASH and contributes to wider societal resilience, is informed by wider societal resilience and will contribute to wider societal resilience. The framing document, which is the scoping document, is available on the website. We have worked very hard to try and articulate the boundary. For this particular project, we are really focused on advising the JMP and GLAAS teams about indicators that are related to climate resilience within the remit of GLAAS and JMP. And the simple shorthand that I use for that is things which contribute to the climate resilient delivery of SDG 6.1 and SDG 6.2, and, you know, wider SDG 6 within the remit of GLAAS. And I think that's where there is a boundary. So we are really not creating a list of societal scale indicators for resilience. It's really about the resilience of the WASH sector within wider societal resilience. I'm just going to catch Juliette's eye. It's always tricky on an online meeting, and just ask her if that's a reasonable expression of what I should say.
Yeah, nothing to add just now, Barbara. Sorry, I was in the middle of answering something on the chat.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah. Also, yes, fabulous having some Australian, there's a whole Australia dialogue going on the chat, I can see.
Good, thank you. And yes, I think there will be some questions, particularly around you know, things like social protection, for example, the extent to which social protection measures are specific enough and directly addressing issues to do with WASH services. Early warning systems is another one which is often referenced. General early warning systems are great. Are they detailed enough to be useful for WASH service delivery? Maybe we can move to mitigation, and I see that Juliet has already started to answer this one, but I don't know whether you want to elaborate. So this was a second question from Dan Deere about the extent to which we're thinking about emissions and mitigation, as well as adaptation and resilience. Is there anything you want to add, or maybe Juliet, do you want to add to what you've already typed in the chat?
Yeah, maybe I'll just call on Juliet. I'm looking for her type and I can't find it, so better let her speak first.
Sure. Yeah, so as I wrote in the chat, this has been an area of debate since we began this work. Any of the interactions have always asked this question, and where we've come to is I guess walking a line, which is to say, yes, some indicators around mitigation are important and useful to include, and we need to also make sure that we're keeping in focus the purpose, if you like, of water and sanitation services. So the wash sector is, there to provide that service, and the prime concern is the resilience under climate change to be able to keep providing a reliable service. And at the same time, yes, we should be minimizing where we can. But to just focus on emissions is a huge scope. Barbara, I, and others are involved in a lot of research looking at nitrous oxide emissions, methane emissions. There are all sorts of things you could look to try and measure, and those definitely are beyond the scope of this global monitoring, which is situated in the wash sector. And those other types of indicators, as I mentioned in the chat, they're included in other global monitoring, including the NDCs, etc., on how we're looking to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So, as I said, we're trying to walk a line where it's included to the extent that it's relevant within the scope of adaptive wash systems, but it won't be a whole module, for instance, in and of itself, just about mitigation indicators. I don't know, Barbara, if you want to add.
Yes, that's absolutely right. And perhaps the one thing I would add also is something that I hold very dear to my heart, which is that there's a sort of philosophical underpin. Well, there's two philosophical underpinnings. One is the mandate of JMP and GLAAS relates to the delivery of 6.1 and 6.2, as I said before, and that's a useful kind of check. It's, the mandate of JMP and GLAAS is not to report on emissions from the water sector, from the wash sector. However, as Juliet said, they're super important. But one of the things that we have to acknowledge is that although so I think the wording that we use, I will just read it out because I think it will help if I can find it. Oh my goodness, now of course I can't find it. Adaptation actions and attributes that are positive for mitigation will be prioritized is the terminology that we use. The point here is that our primary interest is in maintaining service, making sure that services are resilient. And there is a mitigation logic as well, in addition to what Juliet said, because of course, a wash service that fails, particularly in sanitation, by definition, it's not now providing service, but it's also, we know for sure, contributing to uncontrolled emissions. So, our primary interest is in trying to focus on making sure that systems are working. And I mean, I work mostly in sanitation, and it's very clear to me that that includes making sure that untreated wastes are not untreated and unmanaged in the environment, but are somewhere where we can manage them and then progressively improve from a mitigation point of view. It's been a really interesting discussion. I actually feel really comfortable with where we've come to on this discussion now. I think at the beginning it was quite a tough call, but I think we've got to a very nice place. Personally, I'm very happy. Back to you, Tom.
Thank you, Barbara. So moving on, I wanted to pick up on a comment from Angie Fleischer. So you really emphasised, the sort of patchy nature of the evidence, and she's asking, can you elaborate a little bit? What were the criteria applied to assess, the level of evidence or the strength of the evidence behind some of these indicators? Could you just speak to that?
Yes, excellent question. Maybe I'll just call on Anisha first of all, because Anisha did a review of reviews. So Anisha, if you just want to say how you had a sort of slight pre-filter, but I'm sure you were also interested in the quality of the reviews you included.
Thanks, Barbara. So I looked at review papers, which, like you said, also sort of do filter out the quality of data, but we wanted to separate out, first of all, quantitative evidence from qualitative evidence. And just, for everyone's sake, when we're talking about evidence, what we mean is there proof that there was some action taken by a service provider or a particular attribute of the water supply that led to either a positive outcome for users or just continuity of a service level, right? Avoidance of a negative impact. So that's the proof, that's the relationship we were looking for. And so there were quite a few studies that reported this relationship or association in a quantitative way. Like Barbara mentioned earlier in the webinar, a lot of this was from mathematical modeling studies. So they, and those are validated. So there is some weight to that. You know, those models aren't coming from just nowhere, but very few observational studies report quantitative evidence, which basically just some statistical test was done. We haven't discarded any qualitative evidence. It's all in there. It has contributed to our long list of indicators, but we've marked in a particular column whether this is quantitative and qualitative. Barbara, does that?
Yeah, that's fantastic. I mean, just to say also that within qualitative, we assess, I mean, you can have good quality and poor quality qualitative research. So those checks are also included. I'm just going to maybe ask James, do you want to add something on the sanitation? So for sanitation and hygiene, we've done straight, fresh, systematic reviews. So here we were making a quality assessment. So I don't know if James and maybe Lily would like to speak to this.
Yeah, thanks, Barbara. Yeah, as Barbara said, we on the sanitation and the hygiene reviews, we did fresh systematic reviews. So we did our own quality assessments, and we had 10 criteria which we kind of graded each of the resources on, and they were how well the context was described, the aims of the research, how well the analysis and the conclusions, the limitations were described, as well as Anisha mentioned about whether the evidence was qualitative or quantitative, and how spatially and temporally generalizable the studies were.
That's really helpful. Thank you.
Mm.
Lily, do you want to chip in?
Yeah, no, I think that's everything.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks, Lily.
Okay,
I just want to take this opportunity. I know it's a bit out of order, but just again to acknowledge the work of these incredible researchers, because they have genuinely given up their lives in the last couple of months to do this. So it's very, very lovely to have them here talking about their work as well. Sorry, back to you, Tom.
Yes, thank you, Barbara. And it's very valuable to have all of this documented, and if we can make that available to others so that they can review and understand the strength of evidence behind each of these different indicators, that's very useful for them to make their own decisions about, you know, whether the evidence is good enough or not to use these indicators for different purposes. So a couple of questions, similar questions actually, from Tom Heath and from Emily. And I see Emily Gamble, Juliet started to respond about this sort of terminology that we have in the SWA normative definition about, you know, anticipate, absorb, adapt, respond, and the extent to which those are factored into the review. I think Juliet said very clearly that those terms are part of the review, so it's very closely aligned with the SWA definition. But I wondered if you wanted to reflect on the extent to which you know, those things are easy to measure, and whether you find more on some of those than on others.
Yeah, that is a great question. Two small observations I would make on this. So in fact, James and I were talking about this the other day. So one is that we are, to the extent we have thought about whether we could tag every candidate indicator using that sort of scalar of ambition of resilience, if you like. And to some extent you can, but to some extent it's slightly difficult, because you end up sort of saying, well, all of the above, or, you know, so it's a little bit tricky. But I want to just go back to the original point that our ambition is to locate our work within that adaptive resilience idea, the very sort of transformational idea of resilience. So we are not, we are taking into account that perhaps indicators of things which are more ambitious and adaptive are more difficult indicators to collect data for. They're more difficult to assess the quality of the response, as I said, but that doesn't mean that we will exclude them. I think what we will end up with is a family of hard to measure but really powerful, if you could, indicators, which are going to be much more at that sort of ambitious end, and then the sort of family of easier to measure but slightly less powerful as indicators, which are more specific. And I think that's that's where I see this. The interesting thing about taking a monitoring lens is that it's very easy to assume that because we choose to measure something, we are disregarding something that's more ambitious, and that's what we're really trying to avoid, creating that idea. You know, we may end up measuring some quite simple, straightforward, smaller, less ambitious things because they can be measured, but we're really right at the moment thinking quite hard about what we can do to bring in that more sort of higher level of ambition. And again, I just want to emphasize that I think this is where having both GLAAS and JMP lenses to look through is tremendously powerful, both because it forces us really to put a lot of emphasis at that adaptation action end of the puzzle, where a lot of these really transformative, more powerful things will occur. But also because GLAAS have been thinking about this for a long time, not just for climate resilience, but for a bunch of other topic areas. So it's something that we've got a lot of people on the team who are able to speak to. Julia, I don't know if you want to add to that. I mean, it's something that I'm sort of in process of thinking about it, I would say, at the moment.
Agreed. And yeah, when we think about evidence, it's much easier to collect evidence when you know an impact, say that you took an action and there was a climate hazard, and then either you had a good outcome or a bad outcome. That's able to be studied. But if you're taking much more anticipatory actions and you don't see that something happened, you don't know the different reasons why that didn't happen. So it becomes, the measurement question that Barbara's pointing to is quite challenging, but we absolutely recognize that those are perhaps the most critical climate resilience areas that need effort and thinking ahead of time. And so, yeah, as Barbara said, they will be represented, but they may not end up being the most measurable, feasible, practical ones that end up in a final list for global monitoring. But maybe at local and national scales, there may be other ways to use them, and they'll be very, very important for those other purposes.
Very good, thank you. A couple more questions before I pass over to Fiona to talk about next steps. So there are some specific questions about whether the review is hazard specific, and I think that's been answered. So the indicators are being tagged according to hazards and whether they're single or multi-hazard. And then there's a question, a really good question from Abhishek, which I'll leave to the end maybe. And then there's a question about monitoring along the sanitation chain, so looking at the different aspects of the sanitation chain. So that's from Hygiene, Rusatira. And Juliet has said yes, the review is covering all aspects of the sanitation chain. But I wondered if you wanted to elaborate on that, Barbara, because I know it's your favourite topic.
It's my favourite topic. Tom's like, oh, it's Barbara's favourite topic. Yes, absolutely. And I would say, actually, interestingly, I would also like to say that the same thing applies to the water side of this puzzle as well. So, for example, we're not just talking about the tap or the hand pump or the distribution network, but also thinking right up through service reservoirs and supply reservoirs. And the same thing with sanitation. And one of the reasons for that is because I think the team, the consortium working on this puzzle and the Secretariat are really embedded in the idea that even a so-called standalone wash system is rarely a standalone wash system, especially these days, and increasingly, like almost, a very negligible number of people are really kind of truly off-grid. And therefore, if we're thinking about taking sanitation as the example, if we're talking about somebody with a tank that's collecting the waste at the household level, which might be called a septic tank or might be called a chubluk or might be called whatever it's called, it's collecting waste at the household level, but its proper functioning and also its resilience under particularly flooding is going to be a function of all of the services around it that mean it's regularly emptied, that possibly it's inspected for its quality, that the person who built it had adequate capacity and training and knowledge about how to build it, etc., etc. So I think that idea of the full sanitation value chain and the full water service chain is very much embedded in our thinking. And again, I think I want to just sort of link to the work that JMP have been doing on safely managed on-site sanitation, which does reveal the difficulties of monitoring all the way along the value chain, but there's a huge amount we can learn from that initiative. And again, then drawing from some of the lessons of GLAAS, I think there are opportunities to look for indicators at the adaptation action or sort of policy end, which are about recognizing and understanding and coordinating the delivery of the whole supply chain, both for sanitation and water. So it's very much front and center in our thinking. It's not an easy problem to solve.
Great, thank you. And I can see in the chat there's a sort of discussion going on about how easy or difficult it would be to integrate new indicators into the JMP and the GLAAS, and I think Rick has responded to say that, of course, the JMP is drawing on national data and national monitoring systems. It takes a long time to change those systems, and to have standardized information for all countries is a long-term project. But there are opportunities to try out new indicators and to collect new information in the GLAAS questionnaire, which is more flexible, and you can make changes with each round of collection. So it's important to keep that in mind. And then there are some sort of small specific questions which I think have been answered, but there's a big one from Abhishek, which I think we should end on. So this is Abhishek from IRVAG saying this is really impressive work, and there are many others who are congratulating the team, Barbara, so I wanted to highlight that. And then ultimately the purpose is to come up with a small number of global indicators, but how easy is that going to be, given that so many of these risks are very highly context specific? So is there anything that's really globally, universally applicable? I think as global monitors, we believe that it's worthwhile and possible to try and distill a small number of things at the global level. But from your review, do you want to reflect on that question a little bit?
Yeah, I maybe give the floor to Juliet, because she's responded in the chat, but I think, yeah, Juliet, do you want to go ahead and then I'll wrap up at the end?
Sure, I'll give my first kind of top of mind response, which was thinking through, well, the kinds of indicators that you need around the service outcomes and the user experience are perhaps less contextually dependent. We want services to function, we want them to be reliable, we don't want to have long outages, etc. Those may be caused by a whole range of different reasons, but the actual indicators to understand if the service is still working at an acceptable level can be common. But I think, yeah, where it gets sticky is the adaptation actions, because ideally you're taking actions that are relevant for the specific climate hazards that are either being experienced or may be experienced in the future. And we know there's always a lot of uncertainty in any of the predictions that can be made. And so at the moment, as I had written in the responding to someone else's question, we are tagging the indicators in terms of whether they're relevant just to a single hazard like flooding or drought, or whether they're relevant to dealing with a multitude of different hazards. But in the end, yeah, what we need to understand is whether people are taking the right adaptation actions for the hazards that they will be exposed to, and they're two different sets of information. So I don't think it's something we've fully solved yet. I think we've been aware of it from the beginning, but those are a few thoughts that I'm sure, Barbara, you can then add to.
Yeah, no, that's exactly what I would have said. Maybe the point that I would add is just to emphasize a point which I think Juliet had made in the chat earlier, which is that one of the things that we see about this work is that while JMP and GLAAS have an objective, which is to explore whether there should be some additional indicators at global level and some additional data collection. And by the way, as I said yesterday, I think please be aware that we have a sort of null hypothesis position, which is the answer is no. There's nothing additional that is going to be powerful enough or useful enough. So I just want to, it's not a given, although I think it's highly likely that we will recommend a small number of additional global indicators. But just to say, we have to have the open mind because we have to ask every single indicator that's a candidate at global level has to pass these tests, which are difficult. Will it work in multiple locations? Is it powerful enough? Can we measure it? Is there evidence for it? All of those things. But I want to also just emphasize that the Secretariat are also interested in generating ideas and tools and lists and resources that could help monitoring to happen at national or subnational or project level. And so we will be reviewing all of these potential indicators with a view to their specific relevance for, particular climate hazards or whatever it might be. That will also drop out of this work, I think, and that's quite an important outcome. And I'll pass back to Tom.
Very good. Thank you very much. Thank you for all the great questions, and thank you to Barbara and the whole team for answering them. I'm now going to pass over to Fiona from the GLAAS team, who's going to just briefly describe next steps. Fiona, over to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Tom. I was wondering if we wanted to just give the floor for a very brief intervention to Waltaji, one of our WHO colleagues from Ethiopia, who had raised his hand. But Waltaji, can you unmute yourself? Do you want to do a very short reflection before I start closing? Waltaji, are you there?
Yes, Fiona. I'm just unmuting myself. Good afternoon, good morning, colleagues. Thank you very much for the very informative presentation and also the discussion. And sometimes back, I had a very brief discussion with Professor Barbara also on this while she was in Ethiopia. So really, it's very important issue which is being raised, and the discussion here is how to integrate to GMP and the GLAAS. But from the experience, I just want to say in 2 or 3 minutes the practical problem we faced. In Ethiopia, we tried to implement the climate resilient water safety plan first since 2014. And then we brought in the sanitation component. So after implementing, when we tried to develop the framework for that, and then also develop it both, especially for the water, for the urban and utility, also for the community. But after some like 4 years doing the auditing, we found the climate indicators are very rare, and we haven't achieved, though we achieved the other indicators. My issue this last year in July, we had a WASH multi-stakeholder forum. I was invited to do what does it mean CR WASH. So I think in Barbara's presentation, I captured 2 things: the practical monitoring and then understanding of the resilience. The understanding of the resilience is a practical problem we faced here. People are thinking even a big, giant donors of and also international organizations supporting financially, both technically, the WASH sector. The understanding is for example, for the water is related to the drought issues. But in the multi-stakeholder forum, I raised a very some critical issues. That is, what does it mean when we say resilient WASH, when we are doing the feasibility study, when we are doing the design, construction, operational, and also the community engagement, and then the WASH users. This goes for the new one, and then also for the existing infrastructure. So those are, we tried to revise the guideline we have for the water component, including all this. What does it mean when related to drought, flood? What does it mean at the design? This is, we tried to revise this, and then it's with the ministry now to be well seen. And then finally, we are pushing with the WASH partners really to disaggregate to all the steps. Someone has raised the value chain of sanitation. So we need, at intervention level, we need to disaggregate to the whole steps when it comes to resilience. Finally, we need to know also the vulnerability of the WASH sector in the country to apply those indicators. In an area where we don't have the evidence on the vulnerability of the WASH sectors, it's very difficult to integrate also to the WASH programming process. So I think those are the issue which is we are facing and trying to address in Ethiopia from the experience we have over the last almost very close to 10 years. At the end of the day, these indicators need to contribute to the quantity as well as to the quality of the WASH service and the safety and sustainability. So how indicators is going to be selected to all those, and then finally the outcome indicator, very few that can be used by the practitioners on the ground. This is what we are trying, and what we are trying to support also the government. And really, from the global, the GLAAS and the GMP, we need a concrete support and the guidance from colleagues like Professor Berbera and others, and also the whole team in the GMP and the GLAAS process. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Waltaji, for those closing remarks. Actually, that was pretty interesting, because I think hearing from the ground, and I think all this information and experience that you've had will definitely be feeding into this work, because this is exactly what we're trying to do, as well as all the information that we've been collating through this most recent GLAAS survey, where we've incorporated some question on climate resilient WASH, on best practices, on approaches that are being used by countries, and we are now going through all this information, and we've received 100 country surveys for this GLAAS cycle, and we'll be publishing the report towards the end of this year. So we will be feeding also that information to Barbara and colleagues on the consortium. So we're really excited, because I think we are moving in the right direction. With that, I've only got a couple of minutes left to maybe just take you through the next step. So Rick, if you could go to the next slide. And just to share with you a little bit about the public consultation that we are planning in a few months. We've heard about the process and the approaches and the reviews, and coming towards the long list of indicators that will be available for public consultation as of mid-April. After the second technical working group that we're planning, that's taking place towards the end of March and beginning of April. I know that Barbara and the team are working on exploring a user-friendly way of reviewing a large number of indicators, and to make it easier for those that will be providing feedback. And we urge you, and we're keen to have your say, and for you to get involved as of mid-April. We'll have an opportunity for you to provide feedback, review the long list of indicators, and hopefully in a very friendly, user-friendly way, to help fill any gaps that we may have overseen, propose some new indicators, provide any experience, and to help prioritize indicators, because as Barbara was mentioning in her presentation, there are currently 360 candidate indicators on the list, but that's going to not necessarily be the same number as we move forward in the next few weeks. So the public consultation will take place over 3 weeks online, as I said, in the second half of April, beginning of May, and we'll be announcing it through the WHO and UNICEF newsletters, on the website, and through the WASH mailing list. Several of us have been putting that link to sign up for updates in the chat, so please scroll through the chat if you missed that link, but sign up for updates. Check our website. We've also put the website there. And just, we also appreciate those that have reached out. Please do write to the email address that Rick provided in the chat as well. And finally, I'd just like to say that the recording and the slides will be shared with all participants. And I think that question came back, and we would urge you to keep in touch to continue this conversation. And finally, and I think we're just on time for closing, I'll just end by saying thank you for joining us today. Thank you for your interest, for some great questions, for the whole team for answering the questions in the chat, and for us trying to keep track. We really, really appreciate your engagement and commitment, yesterday's webinar and today's webinar, and for your active participation. So thanks to all, wishing you a wonderful day, wonderful end of the day, and end of the week before the weekend. Take care, and thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye. Thank you.
Thanks so much, everyone. Bye-bye.